There is a moment in Hollywood history that most people have forgotten, or maybe never knew, where one of the most beloved actresses in the world was publicly condemned by a United States senator on the floor of the Senate. Not for a crime, not for a lie, but for falling in love. Her name was Ingrid Bergman, and what happened to her? The rise, the exile, the silence, and the long road back is one of the most human stories the golden age of Hollywood ever produced. The world she operated in had very clear rules about what a woman could be, especially a woman who had been placed on the kind of pedestal the American press had built for her. And when she stepped off that pedestal, not with a dramatic announcement, not with defiance, but simply by living her life according to her own feelings, everything that had been constructed around her came down at once. Hard. But before we get there, you need to understand who she was before all of it. Because the fall only makes sense when you understand just how high she had climbed and how fiercely people believed in the image they had built around her. Segment 8. The Girl from Stockholm. Ingrid Bergman came into the world on August 29th, 1915, in Stockholm, Sweden. She was, by almost every account, a child born into loss. Her mother, Friedel Adler, died of an illness when Ingrid was only 2 years old. Her father, Justus Bergman, a painter and photographer with a deep passion for the arts, raised her largely on his own, and poured into her a love of performing that would become the engine of her entire life. Justus would set up a little stage at home, encourage her to perform, film her with his camera. She was his project, his joy, and she loved him back with the kind of total devotion only a child who has already lost one parent can manage. Then, when Ingrid was 12 years old, her father died too. Just like that. The second parent, gone. She was sent to live with an aunt, then another, passed between relatives like an obligation no one had quite signed up for. She was awkward, tall for her age, deeply introverted, and by her own later admissions, profoundly lonely. What she had, though, was the memory of that little stage her father built, and the feeling, unshakable, irrational, completely certain, that performing was the one place she made sense. At 16, she auditioned for the Royal Dramatic Theatre School in Stockholm, one of the most prestigious acting institutions in Scandinavia. She was accepted. Within a year, the school's faculty recognized something in her that was difficult to define but impossible to ignore. She was moved into the main program ahead of schedule. She wasn't technically the most polished student in the room, but she had a quality, a kind of total believability, that made everything she did on stage feel completely real. Not performed, real. Her fellow students remembered her as someone who went very quiet before she performed. Not in a nervous way, but in the way of someone drawing everything inward, concentrating the whole of herself into what was about to happen. One instructor reportedly observed that she did not act emotions so much as locate them. Whatever she needed, grief, longing, fear, she found it somewhere in her actual experience and let it surface. Technique, for Bergman, was always in service of truth, never a substitute for it. This instinct, which she carried into every project she would ever take on, was both her greatest gift and, in certain contexts, the thing that made her hardest to manage. By the mid-1930s, she was making Swedish films. By 1936, a producer at UFA Studios in Germany noticed her and brought her to Berlin to make a German-language film called Die Wir Gesellen, a decision that would raise eyebrows in hindsight, given the political climate in Germany at the time, though Bergman herself was largely apolitical in those years, and the film was a straightforward dramatic production. But it was a Swedish film, Intermezzo, released in 1936, that changed everything. In it, she played a young piano teacher who falls into a relationship with a married violinist. The role required her to be tender, conflicted, achingly sympathetic even in morally complicated territory. She was 21 years old, and she was extraordinary. David O. Selznick, one of the most powerful producers in Hollywood at the time, the man behind Gone with the Wind, saw Intermezzo. He asked for a meeting. Bergman, who had by this time married a Swedish dentist named Petter Lindström and given birth to a daughter named Pia, got on a boat and sailed to America. The year was 1939. The world was about to go to war, and Ingrid Bergman was about to become one of the most famous women on earth. What Selznick saw in her, and what he almost immediately tried to change about her, says everything about how Hollywood worked back then, and about the kind of woman Ingrid Bergman actually was. Segment 7. America and the Making of a Goddess. Selznick's first instinct, as it was with virtually every actress who came through his door, was to reshape her. He wanted to change her name. Too foreign, too difficult. He suggested altering her teeth, reshaping her eyebrows, trimming her figure into something more in line with the Hollywood standard of the era. Bergman said no to all of it. This was not a small thing. In 1939, you did not say no to David O. Selznick. He was one of the most powerful men in the American film industry. Actresses who worked for him understood the dynamic. And yet, Bergman stood her ground, politely, without drama, but firmly. She told him she would play the role in the American remake of Intermezzo as herself, or not at all. He relented, and what happened next was something neither of them could have fully predicted. The American Intermezzo opened in 1939, and audiences responded to Bergman with an intensity that startled critics and studio executives alike. There was something about her that didn't fit the usual Hollywood template, and that was precisely the point. She wasn't lacquered, she wasn't artificial. In a world of heavily styled starlets, she looked like a real person, a beautiful one, certainly, but real. The kind of woman you could imagine knowing. Hollywood's press machine latched onto this immediately. The narrative that formed around her in those early years was carefully tended. Ingrid Bergman was pure. She was natural. She was wholesome. She was, as one famous tagline would later put it, America's favorite wife and mother. What that image required of her, practically speaking, was an almost total surrender of private life to public performance. Not the performance of acting, which she loved, but the performance of being Ingrid Bergman, the symbol. She sat for interviews in which she was asked about her cooking, her housekeeping habits, her devotion to her husband, her simple Swedish values. She answered patiently because she was by nature a patient person and because she understood the transaction well enough. But she understood, too, that the image the press was constructing had very little to do with who she actually was. She was not simple. She was not easily domesticated. She was a woman who had been largely alone since childhood and who had built an entire inner life in the space that loneliness creates. The press wanted sweetness and wholesomeness. She gave them what they asked for. But she did not confuse the performance with the truth. Throughout the early 1940s, the films came in rapid succession, and each one added another layer to the image. In 1942, she starred opposite Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca. The film had a chaotic production. The script was being written as filming went on. The ending was debated until nearly the last possible moment. And yet, the result was one of the most celebrated films in the history of cinema. Her Ilse Lund was heartbroken and loyal and impossible to reduce to a simple moral category, and audiences loved her for it absolutely. Then came For Whom the Bell Tolls in 1943. Gaslight in 1944, for which she won her first Academy Award for Best Actress, and Spellbound in 1945, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. Her collaboration with Hitchcock extended the following year into Notorious, released in 1946, which many film scholars now consider among the finest things either of them ever made. In it, she played Alicia Huberman, the daughter of a convicted Nazi spy recruited by an American government agent, played by Cary Grant, to infiltrate a circle of ex-Nazis in post-war Brazil. The role required her to portray a woman who is simultaneously used, judged, and loved. A woman whose value to the men around her is entirely conditional, and who knows it. The performance was restrained in a way that made it all the more devastating. You could see everything she was feeling, without ever once feeling she was showing you. By the mid-1940s, she had been on the cover of Time magazine. Fan mail arrived in quantities the studio struggled to process. She was, without serious competition, one of the 3 or 4 most bankable stars in Hollywood. And underneath all of it, she was deeply unhappy. Her marriage to Petter Lindström had been strained for years. He was controlling in ways that she found quietly suffocating, managing her finances, her contracts, her professional decisions. She described the marriage in letters to friends as one in which she felt increasingly invisible as a person, even as she became more visible as a star. Their daughter, Pia, was a genuine joy to her, but the distance between husband and wife had grown into something that could no longer be papered over by professional success. She threw herself into work. She took on stage roles between films, including a production of Joan of Lorraine on Broadway in 1946 that was a significant success. She was nominated for a Tony. She kept moving, kept working, kept performing. Because in performance, she was free in a way she never quite was anywhere else. But something was building in her, a restlessness that no amount of work could fully contain. And in 1948, she saw a film that sent it all in a direction no one, not the studios, not the press, and certainly not Petter Lindström, was prepared for. The film she saw, and the man who made it, would become the spark that burned down everything she had spent a decade building, and she walked toward it with her eyes open. Segment 6, The Letter and the Choice That Changed Everything. The film was Paesà, made in 1946 by an Italian director named Roberto Rossellini. It was part of the Italian neo-realist movement, raw, unpolished, shot on location with non-professional actors, dealing directly with the wreckage of the war. It was unlike anything being produced in Hollywood. It was unlike anything Bergman had ever seen. She was transfixed. Rossellini was not a conventional figure. He was intense, impulsive, romantically chaotic, already linked to a series of complicated relationships by the time Bergman encountered his work. He was not a star maker in the Hollywood sense. He had no interest in the machinery of American cinema. But his films had a quality that Bergman had been searching for without knowing it, a commitment to emotional truth that felt, to her, like the direction her entire career should move. In 1948, she wrote him a letter. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary piece of communication. She introduced herself, though he certainly already knew who she was, and told him that she had seen his films and been profoundly moved by them. She told him she spoke English, a little French, and that her German was passable, and that if he could use an actress with those limitations, she would very much like to work with him. The letter was half professional inquiry, half something more difficult to categorize. Rossellini wrote back almost immediately. He had an idea for a film they could make together. He was coming to Hollywood to discuss it. He arrived in early 1949. Within weeks, What had begun as a professional exchange became something else entirely. Bergman and Rossellini fell into a relationship that was passionate, consuming, and, critically, impossible to keep quiet. Both of them were married. She had a child. He had children. They were surrounded by people whose job it was, in one way or another, to pay attention. By the time the two of them travelled to the volcanic island of Stromboli, off the coast of Sicily, to begin production on the film that would bear the island's name, the news had begun to leak. The Hollywood press, which had spent a decade carefully polishing Bergman's image, was not going to absorb this quietly. And then came the development that accelerated everything beyond any possibility of containment. Ingrid Bergman was pregnant, Rossellini's child, before either of them had finalized divorces from their respective spouses. The story broke in February 1950, not gradually, not as a rumor, but all at once, in headlines, in radio broadcasts, in every corner of the American media landscape simultaneously. The reaction was immediate, and it was ferocious. What happened in the days and weeks that followed was not simply a scandal. It was a public execution, and it came from places that, in retrospect, tell you as much about America in 1950 as they do about Ingrid Bergman. Segment 5. The Senator and the Exile. On March 14th, 1950, a United States Senator from Colorado named Edwin C. Johnson stood on the floor of the Senate and delivered a speech about Ingrid Bergman that lasted for some time and covered a remarkable amount of ground, almost none of it having anything to do with legislation. He described her, using language that was extreme even by the standards of the era, as a powerful influence for evil. He called her conduct an assault on the institution of marriage and on American womanhood. He proposed that the Senate consider legislation that would allow the government to regulate the moral conduct of foreign-born entertainers working in the United States, a suggestion that, in the political climate of 1950, carried weight that went well beyond the rhetorical. The speech was entered into the congressional record. It was reported on the front pages of newspapers across the country, and it signaled to the American film industry, which was already nervous about congressional scrutiny of a different kind, that Ingrid Bergman was now someone to keep a very safe distance from. The fan mail that had once arrived in mountains shifted almost overnight. There were letters of support, many of them, from women especially, who wrote with a complicated mix of empathy and understanding. But there were also letters of a very different kind. Denouncements, threats. People who had loved her completely, who had taken her at the image the studios had so carefully constructed, and who felt, in some deep and personal way, betrayed. Bergman and Rossellini's son, Roberto Ingmar Rossellini, nicknamed Robertino, was born on February 2nd, 1950, just weeks after the news broke. The circumstances of his birth, the logistics of what came next legally and personally, were complicated beyond anything a single paragraph can contain. Bergman's divorce from Lindström was eventually finalized in November 1950. She and Rossellini were married the following month, in May 1950. In a proxy ceremony while she was still in Italy, and the legal paperwork moved through Mexican courts. The twins, Isotta and Isabella, the latter of whom would become a famous model and actress in her own right, were born in 1952. But through all of this, the professional consequences were stark and unambiguous. Hollywood would not touch her. Her American films were pulled from circulation in some markets. The projects she had been developing, the roles she had been in talks for, evaporated. Producers who had been desperate to work with her 6 months earlier did not return calls. She made films with Rossellini throughout the early 1950s. Stromboli, Europa 51, Voyage to Italy, Joan of Arc at the Stake. The films were, in their own way, extraordinary, Rossellini was pushing her into entirely new territory, stripping away the Hollywood gloss, demanding a kind of emotional nakedness that her earlier work, as celebrated as it was, had never quite required. Voyage to Italy, in particular, has since been reassessed by film scholars as one of the great works of European cinema, a film about a marriage disintegrating in slow motion, shot with an honesty that was almost unbearable to watch. What is striking about this period, looking back, is that Bergman was genuinely growing as an artist, even as her commercial standing collapsed. Working with Rossellini required her to abandon the supports she had always had in Hollywood. The careful lighting designed to flatter, the multiple takes until every line landed perfectly, the army of specialists whose job was to make the end result look effortless. Rossellini shot fast and rough and on location. He did not build her up. He stripped things down. And in that stripped-down space, something was revealed in her work that had always been there, but had been partially obscured by the polished surface of the Hollywood machine. The irony was sharp. The years in which America had decided she was finished were the years in which she was doing some of the most adventurous work of her career. Film critics in France, where the young writers at Cahiers du Cinéma were developing the intellectual frameworks that would eventually reshape global cinema, wrote about her work with Rossellini with serious admiration. Jean-Luc Godard cited Voyage to Italy as a direct influence on his own approach to filmmaking. The films were not box office successes, but they were not failures of imagination. But the films mostly failed commercially. They were not what audiences, European or American, had come to expect from Ingrid Bergman. And the marriage itself, which had begun with such consuming intensity, was developing its own fractures. Rossellini was, by temperament, not a man capable of monogamy. He had been that way before Bergman. He remained that way during their marriage. The same restless, consuming energy that had made him such a vital artistic presence in her life made sustained domestic partnership with him nearly impossible. He became involved with another woman, an Indian screenwriter named Sonali Dasgupta, and the marriage, which had already been strained by professional disappointments and the sheer exhausting effort of maintaining a life between cultures, could not survive it. By 1957, it was over. Bergman was 41 years old, living in Europe, estranged from her daughter Pia in America, professionally adrift, and emerging from the wreckage of the relationship that had cost her everything she had spent the first half of her career building. What came next? The moment when the door that had been slammed shut began, slowly, to open, came from the most unexpected direction. Not from Hollywood, not from an American studio reaching out with an apology. It came from Paris, and it came in the form of a play. Segment 4, The Road Back. In 1956, while her marriage to Rossellini was still technically intact, but functionally crumbling, Bergman was approached about a stage production of Hedda Gabler, the Ibsen play, to be performed in Paris. She took it. She needed it. Not just professionally, but in some more fundamental way. The stage had always been the place where she felt most like herself, and after years of films made under difficult conditions, with a man whose creative vision sometimes ran directly counter to her own instincts as a performer, returning to theatre felt like returning to something essential. The Paris production was a success, and it reminded people in the European arts community, people with influence, people who talked to other people, that Ingrid Bergman was still, underneath everything that had happened, one of the most gifted actresses alive. The American re-entry began to take shape through a different door entirely: television. In 1956, she appeared in a live television production of The Turn of the Screw, based on the Henry James novella, broadcast as part of the prestigious Ford Star Jubilee series. It was a significant moment. Live television in the mid-1950s was not a minor endeavor. It required a particular kind of discipline and presence that not every film actress could summon. Bergman could. The broadcast was well received. And then came the film that made everything official. Anastasia, released in 1956, was a Hollywood production, but not a Hollywood production she had gone to Hollywood to make. It was filmed in Europe with a British director, Anatol Litvak, and a cast that included Yul Brynner and Helen Hayes. The story was about a woman who may or may not be the surviving daughter of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, a woman whose identity is uncertain, whose past is disputed, who exists in a kind of permanent limbo between who she was and who the world needs her to be. It would be too neat to say the role was a metaphor for Bergman's own situation, but it would also be dishonest to pretend the parallel wasn't there. The film was a critical and commercial success, and in March 1957, Ingrid Bergman won her second Academy Award for Best Actress. She was not in Hollywood to accept it. She was in Paris. Cary Grant accepted the award on her behalf, and when he read her name from the envelope, the audience in the Pantages Theatre gave her a standing ovation. It was, by any measure, one of the more remarkable moments in the history of the Academy Awards. An actress who had been publicly condemned on the floor of the Senate 7 years earlier, whose films had been boycotted, whose name had been used as a shorthand for moral failure in newspapers across America. That woman had just been voted the best actress in Hollywood by the people who made Hollywood films. The standing ovation was not just applause, it was an acknowledgement of the exile, of the return, of everything in between. Bergman heard about it in Paris. By her own later account, she wept. But the return to America was not simply a restoration. The woman who came back was not the same woman who had left. And Hollywood, for all its apparent forgiveness, had not changed as much as it appeared to have. What she walked back into was more complicated than a triumph. Segment 3. The second act, and what it cost. Bergman returned to Hollywood, in a professional sense, on her own terms now. And those terms were very different from the ones she had accepted as a young woman arriving from Sweden in 1939. She was not going to be managed. She was not going to be shaped. She was not going to live inside anyone else's idea of what Ingrid Bergman should be. Between 1957 and the late 1960s, she moved between film, theatre, and television with a freedom that the early years of her career, under Selznick's control, under the studio system's rigid demands, had never permitted. She worked with directors she admired, in projects that interested her, in multiple languages and across multiple countries. In 1958, she married for the third time, Lars Schmidt, a Swedish theatre producer who was, by all accounts, a genuinely kind and stable presence in her life. He was not a genius of Rossellini's combustible variety. He was not controlling in the way Lindström had been. He was, simply, good to her. The marriage lasted until 1975, when they divorced, not in bitterness, but in the quiet acknowledgement that their lives had grown in different directions. The professional work of this period was consistently strong, if not always commercially successful. She appeared in The Inn of the Sixth Happiness in 1958, playing a British missionary in China, and gave a performance that reminded audiences of the warmth and presence that had made them fall in love with her in the first place. In 1964, she appeared opposite Anthony Quinn in The Visit, a dark and morally complex Swiss film that pushed her into territory far from anything the old Hollywood image would have permitted. She returned to Broadway. She continued to work in European theatre. She accepted television roles that interested her without worrying overly about whether they were considered beneath a film actress of her stature. But there were also the roles that didn't come. The great Hollywood productions of the 1960s that her male contemporaries, Cary Grant, Gregory Peck, James Stewart, continued to headline without interruption. Whether this was a direct consequence of the scandal, a function of Hollywood's persistent indifference to actresses of a certain age, or simply the natural contraction of opportunity that comes with time, it is impossible to say with complete certainty. Probably it was all three. Her relationship with her daughter Pia remained, for a long time, one of the most painful open wounds of her personal life. Pia had been 7 years old when Bergman left for Italy in 1949. The divorce from Petter Lindström and the legal arrangements that followed left Pia primarily in her father's custody in the United States. There were years in which mother and daughter barely spoke. Pia gave interviews as she grew older that were not warm. Bergman spoke about the separation with a grief that she never seemed to fully resolve. Eventually, slowly, imperfectly, the relationship was rebuilt, but it took years. And the loss of those years with her daughter was something Bergman carried in a way that was distinct from anything else she had lived through. The professional exile, the public condemnation, the failure of her marriage to Rossellini, these were things that had happened to her, largely, because of choices she had made. The distance from Pia was the consequence she had not fully anticipated, and it was the one she found hardest to make peace with. There was still one more chapter, one more role, and it came in the middle of a battle she had not invited and could not control, and it produced what many people consider the finest performance of her entire career. Segment 2. The Final Years. In 1974, Ingrid Bergman was cast in Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express, directed by Sidney Lumet. The film was a major Hollywood production, star-studded, lavishly mounted, designed as an event picture. Her role was relatively small, a Swedish missionary named Greta Olsen, nervous and devout, and emotionally transparent in the way that particular kind of person often is. She won her 3rd Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. 3 Academy Awards across 3 decades, in 3 entirely different phases of a career that had survived things most careers don't survive. It was a record that spoke for itself. But the Oscar ceremony in 1975 was, in some ways, a bittersweet occasion. Because by the time she accepted that 3rd award, Ingrid Bergman already knew something that very few other people in the room that night were aware of. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer. The diagnosis had come in 1974, and she had chosen to handle it with the same directness that had characterized her approach to virtually everything else in her life. She underwent treatment. She continued to work. She did not make the illness a public statement or a narrative of struggle. She simply dealt with it, quietly, practically, with as much normalcy as the circumstances allowed. She continued performing through the late 1970s. In 1978, she gave what many critics and colleagues considered the most raw and fully realized performance of her career, playing the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir in the television miniseries A Woman Called Golda, broadcast in 1982. The transformation was physical and total. Buried under hours of makeup, she inhabited a woman whose life story was almost nothing like her own, and yet found in her something deeply human and deeply recognizable. The choice of that role, knowing what we know about her health at the time, carries its own particular weight. Golda Meir had herself been a woman who had refused to be defined by the terms her world offered her, who had built a public life of extraordinary scope out of sheer force of conviction, who had been dismissed and underestimated, and had simply continued regardless. There is no record that Bergman spoke directly about this parallel, but it is difficult to imagine she missed it entirely. The production was physically grueling. Bergman was in her early 60s, managing a serious illness, submitting to hours of makeup application every morning, and then delivering a performance that required total presence and command. Her co-stars and the production crew spoke afterward about the quality of her concentration during those weeks of filming, the same inward quiet that her Royal Dramatic Theatre School instructors had noticed half a century earlier. Nothing had changed in that. Whatever it cost her physically, she gave the role everything. She won an Emmy Award for the role. It was her final major performance. Ingrid Bergman died on August 29, 1982. It was her 67th birthday. She had spent her last years largely in London, maintaining the travelling, unsettled life that had defined the second half of her career. She was surrounded by family in those final months, children who had travelled to be with her, friends who had known her for decades. The reconciliation with Pia, though complicated and never fully free of the weight of those lost years, had been real. Her relationship with her children by Rossellini, Robertino, Isotta, and Isabella, was warm and close. In her final months, she reportedly worked on her autobiography, which was published posthumously. She had kept a diary for much of her adult life and was not, by nature, a person who avoided honest self-examination. The memoir that emerged from those last months, written in the knowledge that she was running out of time, is candid in ways that a younger woman protecting a career might not have allowed herself to be. She wrote about the loneliness of childhood, about the marriages, about Pia, about the years in Italy and what they cost her and what they gave her. She did not write as someone seeking absolution. She wrote as someone who had made her choices, paid her prices, and found a way, eventually, to live with both. She died having never fully resolved certain things. The years away from Pia, the marriages that had ended, the American career that had been interrupted so brutally and restored so imperfectly. These were not neat stories. She had not lived a neat life, but she had lived her life. That was the thing. In an era when women in Hollywood were expected to exist primarily as projections of male desire and public fantasy, when the image the studios built around you was the image you were expected to inhabit without complaint, Ingrid Bergman had insisted on being a person, a complicated, fallible, fully alive person, and she had paid an extraordinary price for it. The senator who had condemned her on the floor of the Senate in 1950, Edwin C. Johnson, is remembered today, to the extent he is remembered at all, primarily for that speech. The irony is its own kind of verdict. Segment 1. What She Left Behind. The films remain. Casablanca is still one of the most watched films in the history of cinema. Gaslight is still studied in acting programs and film schools around the world. Notorious, her 1946 collaboration with Alfred Hitchcock, in which she played an American woman recruited as a spy in post-war South America, is considered by many Hitchcock scholars to be among his finest achievements. And her performance in it, restrained and emotionally devastating in equal measure, is central to why. Voyage to Italy, the film she made with Rossellini in 1954 that audiences at the time largely rejected, has since been identified by directors, including Jean-Luc Godard and Martin Scorsese, as one of the pivotal works in the history of European cinema. A film that effectively invented a vocabulary for depicting marriage and emotional disconnection that would influence filmmakers for decades. Isabella Rossellini, her daughter, went on to a career that spanned modelling, film, and television, most famously as the lead in David Lynch's Blue Velvet in 1986. She has spoken about her mother throughout her own career with a combination of pride and clear-eyed honesty, describing a woman who was extraordinary and imperfect in equal measure, who loved her children fiercely even when circumstances made the expression of that love complicated. Pia Lindstrom became a journalist and television personality in the United States. She has spoken about her mother in interviews over the years with a generosity that seems genuinely hard-won, acknowledging the pain of the separation, while also acknowledging that the woman who left was not the villain the press had sometimes tried to make of her. The Hollywood Foreign Press Association, which awards the Golden Globes, established the Ingrid Bergman Award in 1958. The Screen Actors Guild, which had kept a careful distance from her during the years of exile, later recognized her contribution to American cinema with a Lifetime Achievement Acknowledgement. In Sweden, she is considered a national treasure without qualification or asterisk, the greatest actress the country has produced. But perhaps the most honest monument to Ingrid Bergman is not an award or a retrospective or a named prize. It is the fact that the story of what happened to her, the exile, the condemnation, the return, is still being told. That people still find in it something that demands attention, something that says something true about what happens when a woman refuses to be only what the world has decided she should be. She was not a revolutionary. She did not set out to challenge anything. She simply could not stop being a person when the world wanted her to be an image. And everything else. The Senate speech, the exile, the standing ovation, the 3 Oscars, the long, complicated, beautiful, ruined, rebuilt life, followed from that single, stubborn, irreducible fact. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.